You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Welcome to In the Past Lane, people. This is the podcast about history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode number 14. We are coming to you this week from the Common Sense Studios, located somewhere outside of Boston, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook and Twitter, where my handle is @InThePastLane. Protecting our life, liberty, and the pursuit of quality podcasting is our independence-minded executive producer, Lulu Spencer. Well, people, the Independence Day holiday is upon us. And I don't know about you, but I always have mixed feelings about July 4th. Don't get me wrong, I love the holiday. I mean, who doesn't love backyard barbecues, days at the beach, parades, fireworks, and cold beer? I mean, everybody loves that stuff. It's a fun holiday. It says summer. But July 4th also means that summer is zipping by. My mother once told me that her father always toasted Independence Day by saying, "Happy July 4th, the summer's over." Now, when I was 10 years old, I thought this was crazy talk. I mean, there was still almost 2 months left of summer before school started up again. But as I've gotten older, the summer does seem to get shorter and shorter. I think my grandfather was onto something. Well, this week at In the Past Lane, we're not going to talk about summer and sand and sunburns. No, we're going to take a close look at the document that's at the heart of the July 4th holiday, the Declaration of Independence. There's a lot more to this piece of patriotic parchment than most people realize. So here's the lineup. We will start with a look at 3 key things about the Declaration and how it came to be, including the fact that America's actual Independence Day is July 2nd, not July 4th. Next, we examine the fascinating story of how Americans' understanding of the Declaration of Independence changed after 1800, and how this new interpretation has inspired rights movements in the United States and around the world for more than 200 years. Okay, people, keep an eye out for those speed traps. Your journey in the past lane begins now. After years of struggle, the Founding Father had made up his mind. It was time for separation. Time for a split. Time for the people to declare their independence from the colonial power that had controlled them for so long. Time to take their rightful place in the world as an independent nation. Time to control their destiny. And so this Founding Father took pen and paper and he began to write. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For most of you, this seems like a very familiar story. But what if I told you that the year was 1945, not 1776, and that the Founding Father was Ho Chi Minh, the Founding Father of the Republic of Vietnam, and not Thomas Jefferson, and that the mother country was France, not England? Gotcha. Well, it's true. In 1945, Vietnam was a colony controlled by France. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the nationalist movement for Vietnamese independence. And when it came time to announce Vietnam's independence, Ho Chi Minh borrowed Jefferson's famous words to add authority and gravity to his declaration. I tell this story to illustrate just how widely known and influential Jefferson's famous lines in the prologue to the Declaration of Independence became after 1776. It's no exaggeration to say that they are known the world over. They've been invoked and cited in countless freedom struggles for more than 200 years. Well, today at In the Past Lane, we're going to take a close look at the Declaration of Independence to examine 3 little-known and surprising aspects to it. Let's start with the first one. Americans didn't want independence until 1776. That's right. It's tempting to see all the familiar events of the 1760s and early 1770s, events like the Stamp Act riots, the Boston Massacre, and so on, as events along some road to revolution and independence. But the resistance of American colonists to British taxes and other laws in the 1760s and early 1770s was not an independence struggle. The colonists thought of themselves as British subjects, and they were protesting what they considered mistreatment by Parliament. What they wanted was not independence from British rule, but rather fair treatment under it. They wanted a better deal. That's even true as late as 1775, when open warfare had broken out between British soldiers and the colonists' ragtag Continental Army. Then came the tipping point. In January 1776, Tom Paine published his famous pamphlet, Common Sense. It sold an incredible 120,000 copies in just a few months, which is just mind-boggling by colonial standards. Basically, everybody read it or heard it read. And this triggered a dramatic shift in public opinion. Tom Paine's argument was straightforward and blunt. It was common sense that the colonies should break away from England. The time had come for independence. The colonies had grown up, so to speak, and no longer needed a mother country. As Paine wrote, "There is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. And besides," argued Paine, monarchy was a relic of the past. History was moving in the direction of republican forms of government. With astonishing speed, the American people and their leaders began to embrace this view. So this means that when Jefferson was tasked with writing the Declaration of Independence in the summer of 1776, Americans had only recently embraced this idea of independence from England. This leads to a second important point regarding the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson did not write it alone. He had some help. So let's set the stage. As we just noted, the movement towards independence is gaining steam in early 1776. The key moment occurred on June 7th, 1776. That's when Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stood up in the Continental Congress and made a dramatic statement. He proposed that the Continental Congress formally adopt a resolution declaring the independence of the colonies from Great Britain. It read, quote, "that these united colonies are, and of a right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved." The Continental Congress spent the next 2 days deliberating Lee's resolution, and a consensus soon emerged. They agreed that yes, the time in fact had come to declare independence. But they decided to wait a few weeks before making the official announcement, and that was basically to allow a lot of members of the Congress to go back to their home states to get approval to vote in favor of it. In the meantime, Congress formed a committee of 5 to write the announcement, or Declaration of Independence. The members of this committee were John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. The idea was that they would brainstorm about the contents of the Declaration, and then one of them would compose a draft. Thomas Jefferson was chosen as the primary writer, and this made sense since he was well known as a skilled writer. But there was another important factor, and this might surprise you. Nobody else on the committee wanted to write the Declaration. That's right, the other committee members didn't think that this was an important assignment. Congress actually first turned to Benjamin Franklin and offered him the opportunity to write the Declaration, but he declined. Franklin and the other committee members had no sense that this piece of paper would one day become a famous and revered document. To them, it was just a required explanation to the world as to why the colonies had declared their independence. In fact, it was to be as much a declaration of war as it was a declaration of independence. So, what happened next? The Committee of 5 met, and they met only once, to work out the basic framework of the document, and more or less what it should include. Then, Jefferson went to his rooming house in Philadelphia, and from June 11th to the 12th, 1776, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson then went to John Adams and Benjamin Franklin for some editing advice. They made a few stylistic changes, which of course really irritated Jefferson. He hated the editing process, like many writers. But they made some important changes. The most significant change came from Benjamin Franklin. Originally, Thomas Jefferson had written the following: "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." But Franklin offered a slightly revised version. "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Franklin's thinking was that he wanted it to sound less religious and more in step with the Enlightenment. We need also to point out here that Jefferson drew upon one other founding father for help with the Declaration, and that man was George Mason of Virginia. Mason had recently written a draft of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, in which he included the words, "life, liberty, property, and the right to pursue happiness." Jefferson simply borrowed this line and reworked it to make it his own: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But we should point out here that George Mason himself was a bit of a borrower, since it was the famed philosopher John Locke who first crafted a list similar to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. In any case, on June 28, 1776, the Committee of Five presented the Declaration of Independence to the Continental Congress. And this leads to our third important detail about the Colonies' Declaration of Independence. It occurred on July 2nd, not July 4th. I'm sure many of you have heard the recitations of John Adams' prediction that the anniversary of America's independence would be celebrated every year with great fanfare. They would mark it, wrote Adams, as, quote, "a day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore." But John Adams here is writing about July 2nd, not the 4th. July 2nd was the day that the Continental Congress voted to approve Richard Henry Lee's resolution, the one that we noted just a few moments ago, that read, quote, "that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." So technically speaking, America's real Independence Day, its real birthday, is July 2nd, not July 4th. So why do we celebrate Independence Day on July 4th? Well, that's the day Congress approved the final version of the Declaration of Independence, the one largely written by Thomas Jefferson. And one other thing. There was no grand signing ceremony that day. Instead, Congress sent the Declaration of Independence off to the printer so that copies could be made and then distributed throughout the colonies. Most people signed the Declaration in early August. Some of them didn't get to sign it until the final weeks of 1776, months later. A few people never signed it. Okay, it's time for a break. When we return, I'll take a close look at what the Declaration of Independence said and how it became, not right away, but actually decades after 1776, a sacred document in American history. Stay tuned, people. We'll be right back.
You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
If you are enjoying this podcast, then please subscribe to In the Past Lane at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. Subscribing is free, and once you do it, new episodes of In the Past Lane are automatically downloaded to your listening device. Subscribing also gives you access to the entire back catalog of In the Past Lane episodes. And if you do subscribe, please leave a review. Thanks.
So, what did the Declaration of Independence actually say? What was so important about it way back in 1776? If you ask these questions of Americans today, most would turn to those familiar 36 words that are found in the second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, these Americans very likely would be surprised to learn that in 1776, few, if any, Americans cared much at all about these beautiful and uplifting words. They understood the document for what it was, a practical and detailed political statement and not a soaring proclamation of universal equality and human rights. As a consequence, they read the opening section to the Declaration as little more than a flowery introduction to the far more important section that followed, the list of grievances against King George III that justified declaring independence and fighting a war to secure it. This section took up about 2/3 of the Declaration and included more than 24 complaints directed specifically against the king. Let me give you a sampling of them. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. So for Americans in 1776, the Declaration of Independence was inspirational only insofar as it made the case to the world for breaking with the mother country and defending that decision with arms. It was later generations of Americans, long after the Revolutionary War's successful conclusion, who flipped the focus on the Declaration from the list of grievances against King George III to Thomas Jefferson's vivid articulation of the ideals of universal equality and human rights. This process of transforming the significance of the Declaration began in the 1790s, 2 decades after the document was first issued on July 4th, 1776. The Federalist Party, led by men like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, dominated politics in the 1790s. To them, the Declaration of Independence paled in comparison to what they considered the greatest achievement of all, the Constitution. Well, the Federalists were opposed by the Jeffersonian Republicans. This party presented themselves as the defenders of the spirit of 1776 and the American Revolution, against the Federalists, whom they viewed as elitist, pro-British, and even pro-monarchy. As a result, Republicans in the 1790s began reading the Declaration of Independence at July 4th celebrations, and they began quoting it in their speeches. They also took to celebrating the Declaration's author and leader of their party, Thomas Jefferson. In so doing, they emphasized the Declaration, especially that first third of it, as a founding document that condemned monarchy and privilege and celebrated liberty and equality. So when Jefferson and the Republicans came to power in 1801, they saw to it that the Declaration of Independence became firmly enshrined as the nation's great founding document. With each passing year, the reputation of and reverence for the Declaration grew only stronger. By the 1820s, Jefferson himself came to realize that the Declaration was the centerpiece of his legacy. So as he wrote out the instructions for the epitaph that he wanted inscribed on his tombstone, he decided that it would read as follows: "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence and the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia." And then, just in case anyone doubted the importance of the Declaration, Jefferson and Adams died on its 50th anniversary, July 4th, 1826. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. But that's how it happened. And just to emphasize the point, I guess, another founding father died 5 years later, on the 55th anniversary of the Declaration. On July 4th, 1831, President James Monroe died. Now at this point, even as the founding generation began to pass away, the story of the Declaration of Independence was hardly over. By now, the popular understanding of what it declared in those opening paragraphs had begun to expand in ways Jefferson could never have dreamed of. Jefferson, who held more than 200 persons as slaves at his home in Monticello, clearly did not have African Americans in mind when he wrote, "All men are created equal." Nor was he thinking of women when he wrote that formulation. But by the 1830s and 1840s, a new generation of Americans had begun to apply a vastly more expansive interpretation to Jefferson's words. Women's rights activists at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, for example, created the Declaration of Sentiments, using the Declaration of Independence as a template. Its famous opening lines read, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." Around the same time, abolitionists began to condemn slavery as a violation of the sacred principles of equality articulated in the Declaration. In 1854, for example, abolitionists held a July 4th rally to protest the Fugitive Slave Act. And when it was his turn to speak, abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison read the Declaration of Independence and then burned a copy of the hated law. A few years later, President Abraham Lincoln invoked the Declaration of Independence in his famous Gettysburg Address on November 19, 1863. He wrote, "407 years ago," that's 1776, of course, "our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." The American labor movement also turned to the Declaration of Independence to justify its call for equal rights for workers. For example, the Workingmen's Party in 1776 issued a version of the Declaration that began, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the full benefit of their labor." So you can see they're taking the Declaration and using it for their own particular purposes. It's quite brilliant, actually. And in the coming decades, virtually every rights movement, including those led by farmers, workers, suffragists, pacifists, religious minorities, and gays, they invoked the Declaration's equality and liberty ideals to justify their claims. Check out the text of Dr. Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963. He quotes the Declaration of Independence. Some of this ability to see the Declaration as a sweeping liberty document that was relevant to any freedom struggle was due to Jefferson and the choices he made in crafting the document. Two things stand out, and both are found in a single line. The line that reads, "that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Notice Jefferson's inclusion of the word "among." It's so subtle that one can easily miss it, but that one word has enormous implications. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are essential natural rights. But according to Jefferson, they are not the only ones. They are three among many. That one word, "among," left open the possibility that later Americans could discover and secure additional rights. Say, the right to vote, the right to an education, the right to marry the person of your choice, regardless of their gender or their race, and so on. Jefferson did the same thing with the last word in this line, happiness. As we noted, both John Locke and George Mason had the word property in their lists. But for Jefferson, property was too narrow. Happiness, on the other hand, was broad, limitless, and open to all manner of interpretation. Jefferson left open the possibility that future generations of Americans, including our generation, could define the right to happiness as they understood it, just as he suggested that there were many more rights beyond life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this is why the Declaration of Independence still matters, why it's a document for the ages and not just 1776. Although Jefferson did not necessarily have this goal in mind back in 1776, he nonetheless enshrined the radical idea that all are born equal and that all are entitled to what today we call human rights. Since that time, it's been left to succeeding generations of Americans and the democratic process to define, to secure, and to protect those rights. That is a tradition worth remembering this Independence Day weekend. Happy 4th of July, people. And July 2nd, for that matter. Or if you prefer, Happy Independence Day. Well, people, as always, this has been a lot of fun. but I'm afraid we're out of time. I want to thank you for listening, and I encourage you to weigh in with comments, questions, and suggestions via social media and at our website, inthepastlane.com. At this site, you'll also find a show page for this episode that includes links, essays, images, and further reading suggestions related to all the things we've talked about in this episode. Do you want more information about our guests, correspondents, and other contributors? It's all there at inthepastlane.com. And speaking of social media, if you like this podcast, please follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And please, oh please, take a moment to write a review at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access this podcast. Reviews are incredibly important for pulling in new listeners, so please take 60 seconds to leave one. Thanks. In the Past Lane has been made possible by the hard work and dedication of many people. They include technical advisors Holly Hunt and Jesse Anderson, podcasting consultant Daryl Darnell of Pro Podcast Solutions, photographer John Buckingham, graphic designer Maggie Salucci, website by ERI Design, legal services by Tippecanoe and Tyler 2, social media by The Pony Express, risk assessment by Little Bighorn Associates, growth strategies by 5440 or Fight, and of course, 1,000 thank yous to our executive producer, Lulu Spencer. Special thanks also to Jay Graham for creating the intro music for this podcast and to the Free Music Archive for providing the rest of the music for this episode. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world, so let's pay attention to it. Thank you for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey Lulu, how come you're not wearing red, white, and blue?
Are you serious?
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.